We'll go to John in Boone, Iowa.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hey, John.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. My question is, and it's probably going to be mostly directed towards Matt because it's my understanding that you studied this. But I was wondering if, and I know I'm putting you on the spot, but could you maybe talk about or point me in the right direction on where I could learn about the Bible's canon?
Actually, first of all, the Wikipedia entries are a good starting place because they are actually sourced with references outside. There's a website, if it's still live, called earlychristianwritings.com, which will go through what we know about the New Testament in particular, when it was most likely written, what we know about the authors, including fragments of things that didn't make the canon. On the ACA page in the past lectures, you'll find a lecture that I did on the history of the biblical canon that talks about what got in and what didn't. Bart Ehrman has a great book called Lost Christianities, and several others in here as well, that talk about what did and didn't make it in. For example, like, The Shepherd of Hermas is a book that was generally read by Christians. It was considered inspired. It did not make it into the canon. My favorite book that didn't make it in is The Apocalypse of Peter. There's actually two different ones. There's a Gnostic one and the one I'm talking about, which is Peter supposedly talking to Jesus, and Jesus gives him takes him to heaven and shows him kind of heaven. And there's this really very brief, not very specific description of heaven. And then Jesus takes him to hell and marches it around to show all of the very specific punishments. Like the homosexuals are marched up a mountain and thrown off, and they're thrown off onto each other. And then they, as the bodies just pile up, they have to crawl out from underneath this sand pile of gay bodies, and then climb back up the mountain and jump off again is one of the things. And liars are like hoisted up by their tongues and stuff. A lot of this was considered inspired. It was read in Christian churches during the early formulation of the church. And I think the biggest reason it didn't make it into the canon is because it gets kind of disgusting and some people really didn't want to read from it. But it vanished for a while. We didn't have any copies, or we didn't have any known copies. But the ideas remained, and those ideas informed Dante's Inferno. And we now have some copies, or at least some almost complete copies. I don't know if we have just fragments or a large section of it. But it's interesting that those ideas, even though they don't appear in the Bible, stuck with culture this entire time. So people are like, oh, the Bible, it's the most attested book and all this other stuff, and look how it affects people's lives and everything else. And they're just talking about the 66 books in the canon. There's also at least one book that, even though it vanished from libraries, we didn't have a written copy, we didn't have anything to reference, whose ideas were so strong that they stuck with society and wove their way through it. It's the reason why we have the standard kind of depictions of hell.
Yeah, that's just crazy. I had no idea.
Most people don't.
And I'm also interested in what got edited out. It seems crazy that God didn't get it right the first time. Why is there a council of guys that chose what to throw out?
So the actual books, basically, I think it was Athanasius who in Easter Cyclical put together what we think is the first list of the 66 books that are now part of at least the modern Protestant canon. There was a lot of politics going on, and that you had people with very different views of Jesus. You had the Arians and others, and they were constantly in conflict. And it was, if you talk to Christian apologists, they'll say, well, God was forthright and protected his word, and he made sure that this group of people canonized the right scriptures and excluded the right ones, which is basically a case of special pleading.
Yeah, very convenient.
But if you take a look at what actually happened, it's not so much as they went through each book and said, should we include this? Oh, yeah, yes. You guys are no's. We're going to kick you out. There was perhaps some of that where the no's got kicked out. But we ended up with a list of 66, and it just kind of became the de facto. And then there was some voting that took place on it. And there's a number, like James almost didn't make it in because he focuses too much on works. Revelation, the final book, almost didn't make it in because there were people there who considered it the raving lunatic wrote it. and they're not necessarily mistaken. Yeah, there's a lot of good information, better information. That's just stuff off the top of my head and may not all be entirely accurate.
All right. Well, you've given me a lot to look up for. So, thank you for that.
Sure. Thanks, John.
I appreciate the show. Thanks a lot, guys.